The morning sun was rising over the hills of Flores Island in Indonesia when Marcus Chen walked through the gates of the Komodo Dragon Conservation Center for the 103rd time since his arrival 3 months ago. He remembered the first day he came here. A confused young man from California who had no idea what he wanted to do with his life. And now he felt like this place was becoming his home in ways he never expected. Air was thick and humid as it always was in this part of the world. And Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he made his way toward the main facility where the adult dragons were kept in large outdoor enclosures. He had learned so much in these 3 months about these ancient creatures that looked like they walked straight out of a dinosaur movie. Komodo dragons were the largest lizards on Earth. And some of the adults here at the center measured over 9 feet long and weighed more than 150 pounds. They were powerful predators with venomous bites, and Marcus had been taught to treat them with deep respect and caution. From his very first day, the senior staff had drilled into him again and again that these were not pets and they were not friendly, and they would never see humans as anything other than potential threats or potential meals. Marcus understood all of this, and he followed every safety rule without question, because he had seen what these animals could do when they were angry or hungry or simply startled. But understanding the danger did not stop him from feeling a strange connection to these creatures that had survived for millions of years while the world changed around them. He was walking past the breeding area when he heard the commotion near the back fence where the vegetation grew thick and wild. 2 of the local keepers were speaking rapidly in Indonesian, their voices high with concern, and Marcus jogged over to see what was happening. When he reached them, he saw what they were looking at, and his heart dropped into his stomach. There on the ground, barely visible among the dead leaves and twigs, was a baby Komodo dragon, no bigger than a man's forearm. The tiny creature was alone and exposed and clearly struggling as it tried to move through the undergrowth without any sense of direction. Marcus had learned during his training that mother Komodo dragons do not care for their babies after the eggs hatch. The hatchlings are on their own from the moment they break through their shells, and they must immediately climb into trees to escape the adult dragons who would eat them without hesitation. This was the brutal reality of Komodo dragon life, and it was one of the reasons why so few hatchlings survived to become adults in the wild. But this baby was not in the wild, and it was not in a tree, and something was clearly very wrong. One of the keepers, a man named Booty, who had worked at the center for 15 years, explained to Marcus in broken English what he believed had happened. The hatchling had likely come from a nest that the staff did not know about, hidden somewhere near the fence line, where one of the female dragons had laid eggs months ago. The mother had rejected this one for reasons only nature understood. And now the baby was wandering alone with no protection and no ability to find food or water. Marcus felt something twist inside his chest as he watched the tiny dragon struggle. It was so small and so helpless and so completely unaware that death was waiting for it around every corner. He took a step forward without thinking, his hand reaching out toward the creature, and that was when Booty grabbed his arm. The keeper's grip was firm and his eyes were serious as he shook his head and spoke words that Marcus would never forget. He told Marcus that touching the baby would be a mistake, and that helping it would be wrong, and that nature must be allowed to take its course. Marcus pulled his arm back, but he did not take his eyes off the hatchling. Other keeper, a younger man named Addy, joined Booty in warning Marcus about all the dangers of what he was thinking about doing. They told him that Komodo dragons carried deadly bacteria in their mouths, and that even a small bite from a hatchling could cause a serious infection. They told him that hand-raised reptiles rarely survived because they did not learn the skills they needed to hunt and hide and stay alive. They told him that Dr. Wadi Sariana, the director of the center, had strict rules about interfering with natural processes because that was not what Conservation was supposed to be about Marcus. Listen to every word they said, and he knew that they were right about the science and the protocols and the rules, but he also knew something else that he could not explain in words. Something that felt more important than any rule or protocol. He knew that he could not walk away and leave this creature to die when he had the power to help it. The hatchling had stopped moving now and was lying still in the leaves, its tiny sides rising and falling with rapid breaths. Marcus could see that it was weak and probably had not eaten since it hatched. Whenever that was, he could see that its skin was dull, instead of shiny the way healthy Komodo babies were supposed to look. He could see that, without help, this little dragon would be dead before the sun set. Tonight Buddy and Addie were still talking, still warning him, still telling him all the reasons why he should turn around and go back to his regular duties. But Marcus was not listening anymore, because his mind was made up. He had come to Indonesia because he was searching for something, some purpose that would make his life feel meaningful and real. He had spent 3 months learning about these incredible animals and falling in love with the work of protecting them, and now the universe, or fate, or whatever you wanted to call it, had put this tiny helpless creature directly in his path. Marcus believed that there were moments in every person's life when they had to make a choice that would define who they really were. This was one of those moments for him, and he was not going to fail this test. He looked at Booty and Addie, and he thanked them for their advice and their concern. Then he knelt down on the ground, and he reached out with both hands, and he lifted the baby dragon gently off the forest floor. The creature was so light that it almost felt like holding air, and its tiny claws scratched weakly against Marcus's palms. Booty threw his hands up in frustration and walked away, muttering in Indonesian. Addie stayed for a moment longer, his young face full of worry and confusion, before he too turned and headed back toward the main buildings. Marcus stood alone at the edge of the forest, holding a life in his hands that everyone said he should let go. But he did not let go, and he did not put the baby back, and he did not listen to the voice in his head that told him he was making a terrible mistake. Instead, he cradled the hatchling against his chest, and he started walking toward the quarantine building where sick and injured animals were sometimes kept. He did not know if he could save this dragon, and he did not know what would happen when Dr. Suryana found out what he had done. All he knew was that he had made his choice, and he was going to see it through no matter what came next. Baby dragon shifted in his hands, and for just a moment, tiny eyes seemed to look up at him. Marcus smiled down at the creature and whispered that everything was going to be okay. He had no idea if that was true, but he was determined to make it true. This was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. And as he walked toward the quarantine building with the rejected hatchling in his arms, Marcus Chan never looked back. The quarantine building was a small concrete structure at the back of the conservation center, and Marcus pushed open the door with his shoulder while keeping the baby dragon secure in his hands. Inside, the air was cooler, thanks to the fans that ran constantly to keep sick animals comfortable. And Marcus felt relief wash over him as he stepped out of the blazing Indonesian heat. He found an empty enclosure in the corner of the room, a simple glass tank with a heat lamp and some branches inside, and he carefully placed the hatchling on the warm floor beneath the light. The baby dragon did not move much at first, just lay there breathing quickly with its eyes half closed. Marcus pulled up a plastic chair and sat down in front of the tank, watching the creature and wondering what in the world he was supposed to do next. Had basic training in animal care from his 3 months at the center, but nobody had ever taught him how to raise a baby Komodo dragon from scratch. Everything he knew told him that this was probably impossible, and that the keepers were right about hand-raised reptiles having almost no chance of survival. But Marcus pushed those thoughts away, because doubt was not going to help this little dragon, and neither was fear. He was still sitting there 30 minutes later when the door to the quarantine building flew open and Dr. Wadi Suryana stormed inside. She was A small woman in her 50s, with gray streaks in her black hair and glasses that always seemed to be sliding down her nose. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in presence. And when Dr. Suriana was angry, the entire conservation center knew about it. Right now, she was very angry, and her eyes found Marcus immediately. As she marched across the room toward him, Booty had told her everything, and she wanted to know what Marcus thought he was doing and whether he had completely lost his mind. Marcus stood up from his chair and faced her directly, because he had learned that Suriana respected people who did not back down even when she was upset. He told her that he had found the hatchling abandoned and dying, and that he could not leave it there to suffer. He told her that he understood the rules and the protocols and the science behind why they did not interfere with natural selection. He told her that he knew he might be making a mistake, but then he had to try anyway. Suriana listened to all of this with her arms crossed and her expression hard as stone. When Marcus finished speaking, she did not say anything for a long moment. Just stood there looking at him like she was trying to figure out what kind of person he really was. Then she walked past him to the enclosure and looked down at the baby dragon lying under the heat lamp. Her face changed slightly as she watched the creature struggle to lift its head. And Marcus saw something in her eyes that might have been sadness or might have been memory. She told Marcus that she had been doing this work for 30 years and that she had seen many young volunteers come through the center with big hearts and good intentions. She told him that most of them learned quickly that conservation was not about saving individual animals, but about protecting entire species and ecosystems. She told him that getting attached to one creature could cloud your judgment and make you forget the bigger picture. Marcus nodded because he understood what she was saying. But then he asked her a question that changed everything. He asked her what would happen to this hatchling if they did nothing, if they followed the rules and let nature take its course. Suriana was quiet for a moment, and then she answered. Honestly, she said the baby would die within 2 or 3 days. Probably from dehydration or starvation or both. She said it would be a slow and painful death, because that was how nature worked for the weak and the rejected. She said this was the reality of life in the wild, and that humans could not save every creature that was struggling. Marcus looked at her, and then he looked at the baby dragon, and then he looked back at her again. He told her that he was not trying to save every creature in the world. He told her that he was just trying to save this one. This single life that was right in front of him and needed help. He told her that if he walked away, now he would never be able to live with himself. Dear Suriana took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes the way she always did when she was thinking hard about something. She put the glasses back on and stared at Marcus for what felt like forever. Then she did something that surprised him more than anything else that had happened that day. She sighed deeply and told him that he could use the quarantine facility to care for the hatchling. She told him that he would have to do all the work himself because the regular staff could not be pulled away from their normal duties. She told him that he would have to document everything, every feeding and every behavior and every change in the animal's condition. She told him that if the dragon showed signs of suffering with no hope of recovery, he would have to make the hard decision to end its pain. And she told him that when this experiment failed, because she believed it would fail, he would have to accept that outcome without falling apart. Marcus agreed to all of her conditions without hesitation, because this was more than he had dared to hope. Suriana turned to leave, but stopped at the door and looked back at him one more time. She told him that she had seen his type before, the ones who thought they could change the world one animal at a time. She told him that most of them burned out within a year because the reality of conservation work broke their hearts. But she also told him something else, something that made Marcus believe she was not as cold as she pretended to be. She told him that she hoped he would prove her wrong about the dragon because it had been a long time since anyone at the center had surprised her. Then she was gone and Marcus was alone again with his new responsibility, He spent the rest of that day setting up the enclosure properly, researching Komodo dragon care on his phone, and trying to figure out what to feed a baby reptile that was too weak to hunt. The hatchling still had not eaten anything, and Marcus was starting to worry that it might be too late already. He tried offering small pieces of raw fish on the end of a stick, but the dragon showed no interest. He tried tiny bits of egg and pieces of insect, but the result was the same. The time the sun went down, Marcus was exhausted and frustrated and scared that he had made a promise he could not keep. He decided to name the hatchling Ratu, which meant queen in Indonesian, even though he had no way of knowing if the dragon was male or female. Giving the creature a name made it feel more real and more important and more worth fighting for. That night, Marcus did not go back to his small apartment in the nearby village where the volunteers lived. Instead, he pulled a sleeping mat into the quarantine building and lay down on the floor. Next to Ratu's enclosure, he talked to the baby dragon in a soft voice, telling it about his life back in California and why he had come to Indonesia and what he hoped to do with his future. He told Ratu that they were going to figure this out together, even if the whole world thought they were both going to fail. The hatchling did not respond, of course, because it was a reptile and it did not understand human words, but Marcus liked to think that his voice was somehow comforting, somehow letting the creature know that it was not alone anymore. He fell asleep that night with his hand pressed against the glass of the enclosure and his heart full of determination. Tomorrow, he would find a way to get Ratu to aid. Tomorrow, he would start proving everyone wrong. Tomorrow would be the first real day of this journey that he had chosen to take. And as the sounds of the Indonesian jungle filled the night air around the quarantine building, Marcus dreamed of dragons. The first 6 weeks were the hardest weeks of Marcus Chun's entire life, and there were many moments when he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake by taking on this impossible challenge. Ratu refused to eat anything that Marcus offered. No matter how hard he tried or how creative he got with his methods, the baby dragon was getting weaker every day, and Marcus could see the life slowly draining out of the tiny creature that he had promised to save. He tried everything he could think of and many things that other people suggested to him through emails and phone calls and video chats. He contacted reptile experts in Australia and zoo veterinarians in Singapore and herpetologists at universities in America who had spent their whole careers studying lizards. Everyone gave him advice, and everyone had different ideas, and most of them admitted that they had never dealt with a hand-raised Komodo dragon before. Marcus learned that Komodo hatchlings in the wild ate insects and small lizards and bird eggs when they could find them. He learned that they spent most of their first year hiding in trees to avoid being eaten by the adult dragons who saw them as nothing more than easy prey. He learned that their survival rate in nature was incredibly low, with only a small percentage of hatchlings living long enough to reach adulthood. None of this information made his task any easier, but at least it helped him understand what he was up against. On the 10th day of his struggle, Marcus finally had a breakthrough when he tried something that no one had suggested. He took a small piece of raw fish and rubbed it against the body of a dead gecko that one of the keepers had found near the main building. Then he offered this fish to Ratu using long feeding tweezers that kept his fingers safely away from the dragon's mouth. To his amazement and relief, the baby dragon sniffed at the food for a moment and then snapped it up with a quick strike. Marcus shouted with joy so loudly that 2 other workers came running to see what was wrong. From that day forward, he used the same trick every time he fed Ratu, always rubbing the food against lizard or insect bodies to give it the right smell. It was not a perfect solution, but it was enough to keep the hatchling alive, and that was all that mattered. But just when Marcus thought things were getting better, Ratu got sick with a respiratory infection that made her breathing sound wet and labored. Dr. Suyana examined the dragon and told Marcus that this was a common problem in captive reptiles, especially young ones with weak immune systems. She prescribed antibiotics that had to be given twice a day. And she warned Marcus that the next few days would determine whether Ratu lived or died. Marcus did not leave the quarantine building for the next 4 days, except to use the bathroom and grab quick meals from the center's small kitchen. He sat beside Ratu's enclosure around the clock, watching for any change in her condition and giving her medicine exactly on schedule. He barely slept, and when he did sleep, it was in short bursts on the hard floor with his back against the wall. The other volunteers and staff at the center started to worry about him because he was losing weight and had dark circles under his eyes, but Marcus refused to rest properly because he was terrified that if he closed his eyes for too long, he would wake up to find Ratu dead. On the third night of this vigil, Marcus received a video call from his girlfriend, Sarah, back in California. They had been together for 2 years before he left for Indonesia, as she had supported his decision to volunteer abroad, even though it meant being apart. But when her face appeared on his phone screen, Marcus could see immediately that something was wrong. Sarah told him that she could not do this anymore, and that she did not understand why he was destroying himself over a lizard. She told him that she had waited patiently for him to come home, but now she was not sure he ever would. She told him that she loved him, but she needed someone who was present in her life, not someone who was halfway around the world, obsessed with a dying reptile. Marcus tried to explain what this meant to him and why he could not give up on Ratu, even if it cost him everything else. But the words came out wrong, and Sarah started crying. And then she ended the call without saying goodbye. Marcus sat there in the dim light of the quarantine building, with his phone in his hand and tears running down his face. Had just lost the woman he thought he was going to marry someday, and the pain of that loss was almost more than he could bear. But even in that moment of heartbreak, he did not consider walking away from Ratu. He wiped his eyes and checked on the dragon and gave her the next dose of medicine. Right on time. His family back home thought he had lost his mind, and maybe they were right about that. His mother called every few days begging him to come home and get back to his normal life. His father sent long emails explaining that a career in conservation was not practical and would never pay the bills. His younger sister texted him memes and jokes, trying to cheer him up. But even she admitted that she did not understand what he was doing. Marcus loved his family deeply, but he could not make them see what he saw when he looked at Ratu. He saw a creature that had been rejected and abandoned through no fault of its own. He saw a life that deserved a chance, even if the odds were stacked against it. He saw himself in some ways a lost soul searching for meaning and purpose in a world that often felt cold and uncaring. On the morning of the 5th day, Marcus woke up on the floor of the quarantine building and immediately looked at Ratu's enclosure. The baby dragon was moving around more than she had in days, climbing on the branches and flicking her tongue to taste the air. Breathing sounded clearer, and her eyes looked brighter, and her skin had a healthy shine that Marcus had not seen before. He watched her for a few minutes with his heart pounding in his chest, afraid to believe what he was seeing. Then Ratu spotted the food dish in the corner of her tank, and she walked over to it and started eating on her own for the first time ever. Marcus pressed his hands against the glass and laughed and cried at the same time, because this was the moment he had been praying for. Ratu was going to live, and everything he had sacrificed was going to be worth it. Called Dr. Suriana and told her the good news. And even she could not hide the surprise in her voice. She came to the quarantine building an hour later and examined Ratu thoroughly, checking her weight and her temperature and her reflexes. When she was finished, she looked at Marcus with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was something like respect, mixed with wonder, mixed with just a tiny bit of hope. She told him that what he had done was remarkable, and that very few people would have had the dedication to see it through. She told him that she was starting to think maybe she had been wrong about him and about this dragon. She told him that the real work was just beginning, but that for the first time she actually believed they might succeed. Marcus thanked her and then He sat down in his chair and watched Ratu explore her enclosure with new energy and curiosity. He had lost so much in the past 6 weeks. His relationship, his sleep, his connection to his family back home. But he had also gained something that he could not put into words. A sense of purpose that filled every part of his being. This was what he was meant to do with his life, even if no one else understood it. Ratu was alive and getting stronger every day. And Marcus was going to be there for every step of her journey from this moment forward. 4 months had passed since Marcus first lifted Ratu off the forest floor, and the changes in the little dragon were nothing short of amazing. She had grown from a weak and helpless hatchling into a healthy young Komodo dragon that was larger and stronger than wild-born dragons of the same age. Her body was now about 2 feet long from nose to tail, and her scales had developed beautiful patterns of brown and gray and green that made Komodo dragons so striking to look at. She was eating well on her own now, hunting live insects and small prey items that Marcus released into her enclosure for enrichment. But the most remarkable change was not in her body, but in her behavior. And this was what started attracting attention from scientists around the world. Ratu had developed something that nobody expected a Komodo dragon could develop. And that was a recognition of Marcus as someone special and different from all other humans. Every morning when Marcus walked into the quarantine building, Ratu would emerge from her hiding spot and move toward the front of her enclosure. She would press her snout against the glass and flick her tongue rapidly, tasting the air to confirm that it was really him. When other people entered the room, Ratu would retreat and hide. But with Marcus, she remained visible and seemed almost eager for interaction. Dr. Suriana was fascinated by this behavior because it went against everything scientists believed about Komodo dragon psychology. These animals were supposed to be solitary and antisocial, incapable of forming any kind of bond with other creatures, including their own species. They were supposed to view all other living things as either threats to avoid or prey to consume. But Ratu was showing signs of something that looked almost like trust, almost like connection, almost like the beginning of a relationship. Dr. Suriana started documenting every interaction between Marcus and Ratu, recording videos and taking notes and measuring the dragon's stress hormones before and after his visits. She reached out to colleagues at research institutions in Australia, Singapore, the United States, and Europe to share what she was observing. The response from the scientific community was immediate and intense, with experts expressing a mixture of skepticism and excitement, said it was impossible and that Marcus and Dr. Suriana were misinterpreting normal reptile behavior through human emotional filters. Others said it was groundbreaking and could change everything scientists thought they knew about Komodo dragon cognition. Within weeks, researchers started arriving at the conservation center to see Ratu for themselves and to meet the young American who had defied all expectations. Dr. Amanda Foster came from the University of Sydney, where she had spent 20 years studying reptile intelligence and behavior. Dr. Raj Patel flew in from Singapore, where he ran one of the largest reptile conservation programs in Asia. Professor James Wheeler arrived from California, bringing with him a team of graduate students who wanted to write their dissertations on this unprecedented case. Marcus found himself at the center of attention in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable at first. Was not a scientist with fancy degrees and published papers, just a volunteer who had followed his heart instead of the rules. But the researchers did not seem to care about his credentials, only about what he had accomplished and what he could teach them. They asked him endless questions about his methods and his observations and his daily routines with Ratu. They wanted to know exactly how he had gotten her to eat and how he had treated her infection and how he had earned her apparent trust. Marcus answered everything as honestly and completely as he could, showing them his detailed blogs and explaining his thinking at every step. Dr. Suriana watched all of this with a mixture of pride and protectiveness, making sure the visiting scientists did not push too hard or ask for too Much she had changed her opinion of Marcus completely over the past 4 months. Going from skeptic to supporter to something that felt almost like a mentor, she told him one evening that he had a gift for this work, an instinct for understanding animals that could not be taught in any classroom. She told him that if he was willing to stay and learn, she would help him build a real career in conservation. Marcus did not know what to say, because this was more than he had ever dreamed possible. When he first arrived in Indonesia, he had come here searching for purpose and meaning, and now both of those things were being offered to him on a silver plate. The 6-month milestone arrived in early December, and Dr. Suryana organized a small celebration at the Conservation Center. Ratu was weighed and measured and examined from head to tail, and the results exceeded everyone's expectations. She was heavier than average for her age, longer than average for her age, and showed no signs of the health problems that plagued most captive-raised reptiles. Her blood tests were perfect, her scales were glossy and strong, and her behavior indicated a confident and well-adjusted young dragon. Dr. Suryana made a short speech thanking everyone who had contributed to Ratu's success. But she saved her most important words for Marcus. She said that when he first picked up that hatchling against her orders, she thought he was a foolish young man who would learn a hard lesson about the cruelty of nature. She said that she had been prepared to watch him fail, and had even thought that failure would be good for his character in the long run. She said that she was wrong about all of it, and that Marcus had taught her something important about hope and determination and the power of refusing to give up. The other researchers applauded, and Marcus felt his face turn red with embarrassment and gratitude. But the best part of the celebration was not the speeches or the applause. It was what happened afterward. When Marcus went to visit Ratu alone, he sat down in front of her enclosure the way he had done hundreds of times before, and she came out to greet him the way she always did. But this time, something was different. Something that Marcus could feel even if he could not explain it. Ratu pressed her snout against the glass and held it there, her tongue flicking slowly instead of rapidly, her eyes fixed on Marcus's face. It was the closest thing to peace that Marcus had ever seen in an animal that was supposed to be nothing but a cold-blooded predator. He pressed his own hand against the glass opposite her snout and whispered that he was proud of her. He told her that she had proven everyone wrong, and that she was the bravest dragon in the whole world. He told her that no matter what happened next, he would always be there for her, just like he promised on that first day. Ratu stayed at the glass for a long time, longer than she had ever stayed before, and Marcus felt something shift in his heart. This was not just a job anymore, and it was not just a project anymore. This was a bond between two beings who had found each other at exactly the right moment in both of their lives. Marcus did not know what the future held for him or for Ratu, but he knew that they would face it together, and he knew that everything he had given up and everything he had sacrificed had been worth it for this single moment of connection. The scientists could study it and measure it and write papers about it, but Marcus understood something that their instruments could never capture. He understood that love was real, even between a man and a dragon, and that some things in this world were more powerful than science or logic or common sense. That was the truth he had learned in these 6 months, and it was a truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. 3 years had passed since Marcus Chun walked through the gates of the Komodo Dragon Conservation Center as a confused young volunteer with no direction in his life. Now he stood on the shores of Rinka Island, watching a boat approach through the morning mist. Carrying the most important passenger he would ever transport, Ratu was inside a specially designed crate on that boat. Sedated just enough to keep her calm during the journey, but alert enough to be aware of her surroundings, she had grown into a magnificent young dragon over the past 3 years. Measuring nearly 5 feet long and weighing close to 30 pounds, her scales were perfect, and her eyes were sharp, and her instincts were strong, despite Having been raised by human hands, today was the day that Marcus had been working toward and dreading in equal measure. The day when Ratu would be released into the wild. The decision to release her had not come easily, and had involved months of discussion and debate among the scientists and conservationists who had followed her case. Some argued that a hand-raised dragon could never survive in the wild because she had not learned the skills she needed from her mother. Others pointed out that Ratu had shown remarkable hunting abilities in the large outdoor enclosures where she had been moved after outgrowing the quarantine building. Dr. Suriana had been the one to make the final call, declaring that Ratu was ready and that keeping her in captivity forever would be a disservice to everything Marcus had worked for. Marcus knew she was right, even though every part of his heart wanted to keep Ratu close where he could protect her and watch over her. But he also knew that Ratu was not a pet and was not meant to live in a cage, no matter how comfortable that cage might be. She was a Komodo dragon, one of the most powerful predators on Earth, and she deserved to live free the way her species had lived for millions of years. The boat reached the shore, and the crew began the careful process of moving Ratu's crate onto the beach. Dr. Suriana was there along with several other researchers who had flown in from around the world to witness this historic moment. A documentary film crew was recording everything because Ratu's story had captured the attention of people far beyond the scientific community, whose articles had been written about her in dozens of countries, and millions of people had watched videos of her online. She had become a symbol of hope and proof that one person's compassion could make a difference in the world. But for Marcus, she was still just Ratu, the tiny hatchling he had lifted off the forest floor when everyone told him to let nature take its course. He walked over to the crate and knelt down beside it, looking through the ventilation holes at the dragon he had raised from near death. Ratu's tongue flicked out through one of the holes, tasting the air and recognizing the scent of the human who had saved her life. Marcus spoke to her softly, telling her that she was going to be okay and that she was going to love her new home. He told her about the forests and the beaches and the other dragons that lived on this island. He told her that she was strong and brave and ready for this, even if he was not ready to let her go. Then he stood up and stepped back, nodding to the crew that it was time to open the crate. The door swung open, and Ratu stepped out onto the sand of Rinka Island for the first time. She paused for a moment, her head swinging from side to side as she took in the smells and sounds of her new environment. Then she started walking, slowly at first, and then with more confidence, heading toward the tree line where the forest began. Marcus watched her go with tears streaming down his face, his heart breaking and swelling with pride at the same time. Just before Ratu reached the edge of the forest, she stopped and turned around. Looking back at the group of humans on the beach, her eyes found Marcus, and she held his gaze for several seconds, her tongue flicking in and out as if she was trying to memorize his scent one last time. Then she turned and disappeared into the trees, and Marcus knew that he might never see her again. Suriana came to stand beside him and put a hand on his shoulder without saying anything. There were no words that could make this moment easier, no comfort that could fill the empty space in his chest. But Marcus did not regret anything, not a single decision he had made since that first day when he ignored all the warnings and picked up a dying hatchling. In the months and years that followed, the tracking device attached to Ratu sent regular signals that told the researchers she was alive and thriving. She established her own territory on the eastern side of the island, driving away rival females and hunting successfully on her own. Scientists monitored her from a distance, collecting data that helped them understand how hand-raised dragons adapted to wildlife. Everything they learned went into a new protocol that Marcus had helped develop, called the Rejected Hatchling Program. This program gave abandoned Komodo dragon babies a chance at survival instead of certain death in the 3 years since Reitu's rescue. The program had saved 17 other hatchlings who would have died without human intervention. Marcus was now the co-director of the Conservation Center, working alongside Dr. Siriana, who had become like a second mother to him. He had earned his degree in conservation biology through online courses while continuing his work at the center. He had published papers in scientific journals and given lectures at universities and appeared on television programs about wildlife, but his greatest achievement was not any title or award or recognition from the outside world. His greatest achievement walked through the forests of Rinka Island on 4 strong legs, tasting the air with a forked tongue and living the life she was meant to live. Journalists often asked Marcus why he had risked so much for one little dragon when the keepers warned him to stay away. His answer was always the same, delivered with a small smile and a distant look in his eyes. He would say that sometimes the right thing and the smart thing are not the same thing, and you have to choose which kind of person you want to be. He would say that he chose to be the kind of person who helps when helping seems impossible. He would say that he made his choice that day, and he never looked back. Years later, when Marcus was an old man with gray hair and wrinkled hands, he would return to Rinka Island one final time. He would walk along the beach where he had said goodbye to Ratu so many decades ago. He would sit down on the sand and look out at the forest where she had spent her wild and free life, and he would smile because he knew that somewhere in those trees, the descendants of the dragon baby he saved were still living and hunting and carrying on the legacy they shared. That was enough for Marcus. More than enough, because it proved that one moment of compassion could ripple outward through time in ways that no one could predict. He had lifted a dying creature in his hands and changed the course of 2 lives. Forever, the keepers had warned him not to touch the dragon baby, but Marcus Chun had lifted her up and never looked back, and that had made all the difference in the world.